Today, our mission is to cut through a real mountain of legal documents, political chatter, and even architectural blueprints.
Yeah, we're trying to get you up to speed fast on one of the most, well, frankly, one of the most unbelievable stories coming out of Washington right now.
It's truly something. I mean, we are looking at source material detailing a full-blown criminal investigation from the Department of Justice.
The DOJ, yeah.
Targeting the sitting chairman of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell.
It is completely unprecedented.
Just, think about that for a second.
Yeah.
The person in charge of the entire U.S. economy, the head of the world's most powerful central bank, is looking at a grand jury subpoena. He's facing threats of criminal prosecution.
Mm-hmm.
So our job is to figure out what's really going on. You have these two completely conflicting stories. The official one, financial misconduct may be misleading Congress.
And then you have Powell's side.
Which is an absolute bombshell. He's claiming this is just political revenge because of his interest policy.
And look, this is so much more than just another political fight. This is a high-stakes showdown, and it really strikes at the heart of the Federal Reserve's independence, which is something we normally just, take for granted.
For anyone who follows finance or politics, the fact that the executive branch is even doing this, it's a global story. The potential fallout for monetary stability is just huge.
It really is.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start with the legal attack itself. According to the sources, what is the DOJ actually focused on?
So the investigation, which was kicked off by the D.C. Federal Prosecutor's Office, it really zooms in on two main areas.
Okay.
And they're both connected to that huge $2.5 billion renovation project at the Fed's headquarters.
So the first thing is the money, right? The project has these massive cost overruns.
Exactly. But the second thing, and this is the really dangerous one, is whether Chair Powell lied.
Lied to Congress.
Misled Congress, yes, during his testimony about the project last June. And that's a potential felony charge.
Right. And we can't talk about the legal side without the political side. The sources are very clear on this part.
Oh, absolutely. The person who approved this whole investigation back in November, it's the head of the D.C. office, Jeanine Pirro.
Who is noted everywhere as a very long time, very public ally of President Trump.
Right. So that political connection is there from day one. It's, you could say, the foundational fact of this whole story.
That timing just makes everything so much more sensitive, doesn't it? The investigation gets the green light just a few months before Powell's term as chair is set to expire this May.
It's an incredibly tight timeline.
I mean, he can technically stay on as a governor until 2028, but the top job, the chairmanship, that's ending.
And the sources are already saying President Trump has his replacement picked out. An announcement is expected any day.
Kevin A. Hassett is the name being floated.
That's the one.
Yeah.
So you see this perfect storm brewing. You've got legal pressure ramping up right as the clock is ticking down on his leadership.
And the sources say the pressure is intense. We're talking a grand jury subpoena, explicit threats of prosecution, all tied to that testimony he gave in June.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where the story just explodes. I mean, it goes from being about budgets and construction to being a full-on political war. Powell's response wasn't defensive.
No, not at all. It was a direct counterattack.
What did she say?
He basically denies that the investigation is really about the renovation or even what he said in his testimony. He calls the threat of charges a pretext.
A pretext for what?
For this. And this is the key quote you need to hear. He says the real reason they're threatening him is because of the Fed's insistence on setting interest rates based on its best assessment of the public interest.
Not following presidential preferences.
Exactly.
Wow. I mean, that is a staggering claim to make. He's saying this isn't about marble floors. This is about the separation of powers.
He's saying it's a direct assault on the Fed's independence.
And I guess that's the subtext we have to keep in mind through this whole deep dive, isn't it? The investigation itself, even if it goes nowhere.
Right, even if there's never a charge.
The act of launching it is a message. It's a tool of power being used against an agency that's supposed to be independent.
A very powerful one.
So before we get too deep into the political warfare side, let's look at the official reason. Let's look at the ammunition they're using. Was this renovation project really that bad?
Well, let's get into the specifics of this $2.5 billion sinkhole.
Okay.
The building is the Mariner S. Eccles building. It's a historic landmark on Constitution Avenue, built back in the 30s.
Oh, it's old.
It's very old.
Yeah.
And the project is massive. It's expanding and modernizing two buildings. It started back in 2022. It's supposed to be done in 2027. So, it's a huge job.
And the cost, I mean, you can't deny the numbers. It's currently about $700 million over budget.
It's a huge number.
That's more than a quarter of the original budget. That's not small change.
No, it's not. And the Fed's official line points to, the usual culprits you hear about in big construction projects.
Materials, labor costs.
Right, skyrocketing costs for materials, equipment, labor. But they also said they ran into big, unforeseen problems.
Like what?
Specifically, much higher levels of asbestos than they expected, and soil contamination. They made a point of saying these buildings haven't had a, quote, comprehensive renovation in almost 100 years.
That sounds plausible, I guess, sort of a historical building nightmare. But the legal charges aren't about bad construction management, they're about deceit.
Exactly.
The accusation is that Powell lied to Congress about the scope. So tell us about the juicy details, the things that really made the headlines.
Right, this is what caught everyone's attention. The allegations were all about these proposals from 2021 for really extravagant features.
For who?
For the senior decision makers. We're talking things like dedicated private elevators, luxury VIP restaurants, and all this new marvel.
See, that's the kind of stuff that's designed to make people angry.
Of course. If I was on that committee, I'd be demanding answers too. A VIP restaurant inside the Fed? It sounds like a joke.
It paints a picture of, out-of-control bureaucrats living in luxury while they're telling everyone else to tighten their belts.
That was the exact narrative his opponents were building. And that's what Powell had to answer to, under oath, last June.
And this is where it gets really tricky. Because Powell didn't just issue a blanket denial, he was very, very specific in his corrections.
What's fascinating here is how meticulous he was. He said, and I'm quoting, "There was no VIP restaurant and no new marble."
No new marble at all.
Well, he clarified. He said the project involved taking out the old marble tiles, cleaning them, and then putting them back. They only used new marble to replace pieces of the old stuff that were broken.
Okay, what about the elevators? The private elevators?
He said they were only renovating the old elevator system that was already there. He was emphatic. No new dedicated private elevators were being installed.
So the Fed's argument is that these outrageous features were either just, blown way out of proportion.
Or they were ideas that got thrown around early on and then scrapped. The Fed said the project plans had, quote, constantly evolved.
Right, and later they went into full damage control mode, didn't they?
Oh, yeah, full PR defense.
Yeah.
They published FAQs. They even put out a virtual tour of the planned renovation, all to back up what Powell said in his testimony.
Which just goes to show how much of a political problem this renovation was long before the DOJ ever got involved.
It was the perfect legal hook for them to use, a real lightning rod.
Which brings us right back to Powell's claim, the politics of monetary policy. We know there's a history of friction between President Trump and the Fed. What does that history look like?
It's a long one, and a very public one. Throughout his term, President Trump was constantly pressuring Powell for big interest rate cuts.
He wasn't subtle about it.
Not at all. He would often link the Fed's decisions to his own political needs, or, how the stock market was doing that day. He publicly called Powell incompetent. He even threatened to remove him.
Which is just not something you typically see. There's usually a bit of tension, but this was different.
It was. And the sources point out it wasn't just about Powell. You had that whole situation with Fed Governor Lisa D. Cook.
The attempt to remove her, right?
Right, over accusations of mortgage fraud. And that case is actually still going. The Supreme Court is scheduled to hear arguments on January 21st.
That Cook case is so relevant here because it's all about the limits of presidential power over the Fed. I mean, why is the Fed independent in the first place?
It's the whole foundation of the institution, really. Congress set it up that way on purpose to shield it from exactly this kind of short-term political pressure.
So they can focus on the economy, not elections.
Exactly. The Fed's job is to keep inflation low and employment high. That's it, without worrying about a president's poll numbers. If a president could just order rate cuts, the whole system could be destabilized for political gain.
And that brings us back to the law. A president can't just fire a Fed official, can they?
The bar is incredibly high. They can only be removed for just cause.
Which means what, exactly?
Things like neglect of duty or serious misconduct.
Ah, and here's where it gets really interesting.
This is the critical connection you have to make.
Powell's term as chair is up in May, but his term as a governor on the board, that runs until 2028.
And a new administration can't just fire him from that governorship.
But if this DOJ investigation were to prove that he lied under oath to Congress about the renovation,
that would be the just cause.
That would be the misconduct they need to justify removing him entirely, even from his governor role.
Precisely. It would clear the way for a new administration to install their own person immediately. The renovation details, the marble, the budget, they become a legal Trojan horse.
So it's not just about getting him for lying. It's about fundamentally changing the makeup of the Federal Reserve Board.
It's about control. Control over the Fed for the next 4 years. This isn't just about a short-term indictment. It's about a long-term power shift.
So let's talk about the legal reality here. There's a huge gap between launching a big, splashy investigation and actually getting an indictment, especially in D.C.
A massive gap, and the sources point this out. They cite a bunch of recent high-profile investigations into other political figures, people like James Comey, Letitia James, Adam Schiff.
And what happened with those?
They were either dismissed or they just failed to produce enough evidence to actually bring charges. The legal system moves slowly, and the standard of proof is very high.
So the goal might not actually be a conviction?
No. The goal is leverage. The investigation itself is the weapon.
How so?
Just by existing, it creates enormous pressure. Political pressure, professional pressure, personal pressure. For a Fed chair, the uncertainty alone could spook the markets and damage trust in the institution.
So launching the investigation is the point.
It's the leverage. It's an immediate threat that can be used to force someone to change their behavior, or maybe even just resign.
It's a warning shot. It puts the Fed on notice. Go against our policy preferences, and you do so at your own risk.
That is exactly it. And that's why this is such a fundamental challenge to the whole idea of independence.
So let's try to pull this together for the listener, because you're really looking at a classic Washington two-track reality here. Is this an investigation driven by a legitimate anger over a $2.5 billion project and potential lies to Congress? Or is it, like Chairman Powell claims, this unprecedented abuse of power using the DOJ to punish the central bank for daring to disagree on interest rates?
Oh, you have to ask yourself, would this investigation have been launched with this much speed, with this much intensity, if those deep policy disagreements over interest rates didn't exist?
Probably not.
I think it's hard to imagine. The policy fight provides the powerful motive. The renovation and the testimony, they provide the perfect and, frankly, politically irresistible legal cover.
So, in a way, the damage is already done, isn't it? Whether or not a grand jury ever indicts him, the threat has been made. The perception of the Fed's independence has been hit.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, yes. The uncertainty this creates is destabilizing. It hits the Fed's leadership at a time when making monetary policy is already incredibly complicated.
And we still have this unresolved issue of Powell's governorship. His chairmanship ends in May, but that seat on the board is his until 2028.
And he hasn't said if he plans to stay on, especially with this legal cloud hanging over him. So now all the attention shifts to who will be named as his successor.
The clock is definitely ticking.
It is. And the question of who leads the Fed next and under what kind of political pressure is completely up in the air.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought for you, the listener, to chew on. This entire situation has dramatically raised the stakes for any future Fed chair, no matter who they are or what party they're from. If the threat of a high-level criminal investigation, even one that never results in charges, becomes a standard tool in the White House's toolkit, does that fundamentally change how independent a central bank can ever really be?
It shifts the entire calculus, doesn't it?
It does. It moves the job description from complex economic management to, well, personal legal risk management. And that is a massive, massive change for the institution.
A profound question, really, about the future of global finance.
That's our deep dive for today. Thank you for joining us. We hope you feel a lot more informed than when we started.
Until next time.